The stillness. The old house groaned around Alex like a dying beast. He'd bought it for a steal, a charmingly dilapidated Victorian on the overgrown fringe of town. It was his escape from the city, from the noise, from the crushing weight of too many people. He'd craved solitude, and for the first few weeks the house had given him exactly that. A peaceful, echoing quiet. But the quiet had begun to change. It started subtly. A floorboard creaking upstairs when he was in the kitchen. The soft, dry whisper of a door settling in its frame. Alex, a man of logic and reason, dismissed it all as the house's personality, the natural soundtrack of an old building. He was alone, after all, completely and utterly alone. One Tuesday evening, while reading in the living room, he heard it again, a distinct thump from the second floor. Not a creak this time, but a solid, deliberate sound, like something had been set down. Alex put his book on his chest, his ears straining in the sudden ringing silence. He waited. 1 minute, 2, nothing. He told himself it was a branch against the roof, whipped by the wind. But there was no wind tonight. The air outside was unnervingly still, the skeletal trees standing black and motionless against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He went back to his book, but the words swam before his eyes. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It felt watchful. A few nights later, Alex was woken from a deep sleep by a sound. It was faint, but it was the reason that was so terrifying. It was the soft melodic hum of a lullaby. The tune was unfamiliar, a simple looping melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The humming continued for a few more seconds, then faded into the oppressive silence. He was drenched in a cold sweat. There was no one else in the house. There couldn't be. He had checked every lock, every window before bed. The next morning he found a child's rocking chair in the corner of the attic. He'd explored the attic before, a dusty cavern of cobwebs and forgotten furniture. He was certain the rocking chair hadn't been there. It was small, made of dark polished wood, and it was positioned facing the single grimy window. As he stared at it, a cold draft, impossible in the stuffy attic, seemed to slither past him, and the chair rocked just once with a soft, dry creak. That was when the real fear began to set in. It wasn't the fear of a ghost, a specter in a white sheet. It was something far more primal. It was the fear of the unknown, the slow, creeping certainty that he was not alone in his solitude. He started noticing other things, a book misplaced from its shelf, a single cold spot in the hallway that never seemed to warm. The unnerving feeling of being watched, a prickling on the back of his neck that would cause him to spin around to find only empty rooms and lengthening shadows. One evening, driven by a desperate need to reclaim his sanity, Alex decided to record the silence of the house. He set up a microphone in the living room, hit record on his laptop, and left for a long walk. He needed to be out of the house, away from its suffocating presence. When he returned, the house was as silent and still as he had left it. He sat at his laptop, took a deep breath, and played back the recording. For the first hour, there was nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sigh of the wind. Alex began to relax, a small, hopeful smile touching his lips. It was all in his head, just the anxieties of a new place, of being alone. And then he heard it. It was a soft sound, barely audible at first, a faint, rhythmic scratching. Then a whisper. It was too low to make out the words, a dry, sibilant sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. Alex turned up the volume, his hand trembling. The whispering grew clearer, closer. It was a woman's voice, old and cracked, and she was talking to someone. Then he heard a second voice, a child's voice. It was a soft, innocent giggle that sent a shard of ice through Alex's veins. He listened, paralyzed, as the whispering and giggling continued, punctuated by the soft creak of the rocking chair he had found in the attic. They were not just sounds, they were a conversation happening in his empty, silent house. The recording ended. Alex sat in the dark, the only light coming from the laptop screen illuminating his pale, horrified face. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken presence of those who had been there all along, their whispers and laughter now a permanent echo in the once peaceful quiet he had so desperately craved. He was the intruder, and he was not welcome. He finally understood. The house wasn't groaning like a dying beast, it was breathing. The road home, Sarah always felt a little uneasy driving the back roads to her parents' house. It wasn't that they were particularly isolated. There were a few scattered farms and the occasional darkened house, but there was a stretch of about 5 miles that felt different. The trees grew denser there, their branches clawing over the narrow asphalt, and even on a clear day, the sunlight seemed reluctant to penetrate the canopy. One Friday night, Sarah was making that drive later than usual. A meeting at work had run long, and the last sliver of sunset had bled out of the sky, leaving a deep, starless blackness. Her headlights cut twin tunnels through the darkness, illuminating only the immediate stretch of road ahead. The radio was crackling with static, so she turned it off, the silence amplifying the hum of her tires on the worn pavement. As she entered the dense wooded section, she saw something in her headlights, a figure standing by the side of the road. Her first thought was that someone had broken down, needed help. She slowed down, squinting through the windshield. It was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, facing away from the road, towards the dark wall of trees. She was wearing a long, pale dress that seemed to glow faintly in the headlights. Sarah pulled over a little ahead of her, put the car in park, and rolled down her window. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice a little shaky in the stillness. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman didn't move, not even a flicker. Sarah waited a moment longer, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Maybe she hadn't heard. Sarah opened her car door and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder. The air was cold and damp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves. She could hear the faint rustling of something in the undergrowth. "Excuse me?" Sarah said, taking a few steps closer. The woman remained motionless, her posture unnaturally rigid. Sarah could now see the details of her dress, a simple white gown that looked old-fashioned. Her hair was dark and hung straight down her back, obscuring her face. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Sarah asked, her concern turning into a prickle of fear. There was something deeply unsettling about this figure's stillness in the overwhelming darkness. She took another step closer and was about to speak again when the woman slowly, deliberately, turned her head. Sarah froze. The woman's face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and dark, reflecting the headlights like pools of black ink. There was an expression on her face that Sarah couldn't quite decipher, but it was profoundly sad and utterly terrifying. And then Sarah noticed something else. The woman's feet weren't on the ground. They were a few inches above the loose gravel of the shoulder. Panic seized Sarah. Without a word, she stumbled backward, scrambling back into her car. She slammed the door shut, fumbled with the gear shift, and jammed her foot on the accelerator. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, and the car lurched forward. She didn't look in her rearview mirror. She didn't dare. She just drove, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She kept expecting to see that pale figure in her mirror, floating behind her, but there was only the blackness of the road receding. When she finally reached the familiar glow of her parents' porch light, she felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made her weep. She stumbled out of the car, her legs shaky, and practically ran to the front door. She recounted the story to her bewildered parents, who tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe she'd imagined things in the dark, but Sarah knew what she had seen. She knew the feeling of cold dread that had washed over her when that woman turned her head. Even now, years later, Sarah avoids driving those back roads at night. And whenever she has to, she grips the steering wheel a little tighter as she passes that darkened stretch, her eyes flicking nervously to the side of the road, half expecting to see a pale figure standing silently beneath the trees. She knows, with a chilling certainty, that she saw something that night, something that wasn't quite of this world, waiting by the side of the road in the oppressive darkness, and she shudders to think what might have happened if she had stayed a moment longer. The mail slot. Leo's apartment was his sanctuary, a minimalist box of white walls and clean lines on the 7th floor of a secure modern building. The building's best feature, in his opinion, was its anonymity. He'd lived there for 2 years and barely knew his neighbors beyond a polite nod in the elevator. It was exactly the kind of quiet, impersonal existence he preferred. The first one arrived on a Monday. It was a single, plain white envelope pushed so far through the mail slot in his front door that it had fallen silently onto the polished concrete floor. There was no stamp, no return address, and no name. Just a single, neatly typed word on the front. Watching. Leo stared at it, a flicker of annoyance mixing with confusion. He assumed it was a prank. Some kids in the building, maybe. He tossed it in the recycling bin without opening it and thought nothing more of it. The second one came on Wednesday. It was identical to the first. Plain white envelope, no markings, pushed all the way through the slot. This time, the typed word was always. He didn't throw this one away. He held it, turning it over in his hands. The paper was crisp and of good quality. There was no scent, no smudge, nothing to give away its origin. He felt a prickle of unease. This felt less like a prank and more like a message. But from whom? And why? He walked to his window and looked down at the street 7 floors below. The usual anonymous city crowd bustled by. No one seemed to be looking up. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The normal city sounds, the distant siren, the rumble of the late-night train, seemed different, menacing. He kept picturing someone standing silently in the hallway outside his door, their hand reaching for his mail slot. On Friday, he was dreading his return from work. As he walked down the long, quiet hallway to his apartment, 7B, he could see it from a distance. A sliver of white protruding from the black metal of his mail slot. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled it out. This time there were 2 words, your balcony. Leo's blood ran cold. He lived alone. He rarely used the small balcony that overlooked the building's sterile inner courtyard. He unlocked his door, his hands trembling slightly, and scanned the apartment. It was empty, exactly as he'd left it. He walked slowly to the sliding glass door of the balcony. It was locked from the inside, just as he always left it. He stepped out into the chilly evening air. The courtyard below was empty, bathed in the cold blue light of dusk. The balconies of the other apartments formed a grid around him, most of them dark and empty. There was nothing out of the ordinary, and yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was a physical sensation like a pressure on his skin. He decided not to wait for the next note. The next day, Saturday, he bought a cheap security camera, a small black dome he could connect to his phone. He positioned it on a bookshelf opposite his front door, giving it a clear view of the mail slot. He felt a small measure of control return. He would catch whoever was doing this. For 3 days, nothing happened. No envelopes appeared. Leo started to relax, wondering if his camera had scared them off. On the 4th day, Tuesday, he was in a meeting at work when his phone buzzed with a notification from the camera app. Motion detected at your front door. He quickly opened the live feed. His heart leaped into his throat. The hallway outside his door was empty, but on his floor inside his apartment lay a new white envelope. It hadn't been pushed through. It was already inside when the motion sensor was triggered. He stared at the live feed, his mind reeling. How? How could anyone get in? He checked the logs. The door hadn't been opened. No one could have gotten in. Then he saw it. On the screen, from the very edge of the camera's frame, a thin, pale finger emerged. It slowly, deliberately pushed the white envelope into the center of the view. The finger was long and white, with a dirty, jagged nail. Then, just as slowly, it retreated, disappearing out of the frame. Leo felt a wave of nausea. The camera wasn't pointed at his door from the hallway. It was inside his apartment on his bookshelf. The motion it had detected, the finger it had filmed, it had come from inside the room, from somewhere just out of the camera's view. He was still staring at the screen, paralyzed, when his phone buzzed again. It wasn't a camera notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. It contained a single terrifying image, a live photo of him. He was sitting at his conference table at work, staring at his phone, his face pale with horror. The note on his floor, the finger in the video, the photo on his phone. It all led to one impossible, gut-wrenching conclusion. Whoever was watching him wasn't in the hallway. They weren't in the courtyard below. They were already inside.